Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 15.7, social issues during the 1950s. We'll be looking at some of the arguments that were made by critics who rejected some of the cultural aspects in the 1950s. We'll look at the causes and effects of urban and rural poverty during this period of time in history, and we'll explain the problems that many minority groups faced in the post-World War II era. Number one, during the 1950s, different social issues emerged. Identify social issues that cause discontent among some Americans in the United States. So some of the social problems during this period of time: minorities did not receive equal opportunities to succeed. A quarter of the nation lived in poverty. When you think about a modern, powerful country like the United States here in the 1950s, it's kind of hard to believe that close to 25% of all Americans were living in poverty. Urban or city areas began to decline as the middle class moved to the suburbs and left behind some of the urban poor. Social critics, The Lonely Crowd, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, all explored some of the themes of alienation during the 1950s. Many consider the 1950s also to be a decade of conformity. For the first time, Americans had disposable incomes with the wide variety of new products available. People began to spend money. Neighbors attempted to keep up with one another. We may have touched a little bit upon this previously, even with the Levittown situation. As people moved into those Levittown homes, they had almost identical homes, one after the other. Everybody wanted like kind of an identical lifestyle. And even when it came to, let's say, landscaping, maybe somebody put some in new shrubs or plants, and the neighbor tried to do that. So there's all this kind of keeping up with the Joneses kind of mentality during this period of time that everybody wanted to, be similar to the neighbor. They didn't want to kind of fall behind in terms of what was considered to be the sort of so-called middle-class ideal lifestyle. Also, too, during this period of time, advertisements had a big impact on the decade of conformity. If you're living in 1720, you may never even heard of some of the things that were going on and the different things people were getting. You might not know what somebody's doing in New Jersey versus, let's say, in North Carolina. But here in the 1950s, a couple hundred plus years later, you're seeing a whole lot of advertisements being used to kind of promote this kind of similar sense of lifestyle for everyone. Companies spend a great deal of time and money kind of targeting certain groups to convince consumers to purchase their products. Now, not everybody was a conformist during this period of time. You had the beatniks, who you can see in the photograph down below. In the 1950s, they were anti-establishment citizens who refused to conform to the social norms within society at this time. So whether it be the way they dressed, the fact that maybe they were not willing to even work a steady job, some kind of were street performers, kind of just as you see here, performing there on the bongo drums. They had a situation where they kind of rejected everything. They fought back against the government, against authority figures, teachers and government officials, and even your parents, maybe something you might have kind of rebelled against during this period of time if you're a member of the anti-establishment. Five describes the roots of rock and roll music. What other types of music contributed to this style, and how did rock and roll music evolve? Well, rock and roll music originated in the African American rhythm and blues style. Other types of music that contributed to the development of rock and roll included the boogie woogie sounds. When you think about who emerged as the absolute king, the king of rock and roll, there's only one king: Elvis Presley. 7, explain Michael Harrington's theory of the culture of poverty. He addressed this in his book, The Other America. Now, The Other America, obviously, you could probably make a determination that he's referencing the 25% of Americans during this period of time who were living in poverty in 1950s into 1960. He claimed that somewhat staggering number of 50 million Americans, or 25% of the population. So we had around 200 million people in the country at the time in the late 50s, around 1960. And of that 200 million, roughly 50 million, or 1 in 4, were living in poverty. So certainly a very disappointing situation. He argued, too, the poor are more vulnerable than other parts of society, which kind of perpetuates this constant situation of poverty within society. For example, unsanitary conditions in some of the poorer neighborhoods allowed for them to get sick more easily, resulting in a loss of wages, which would further be like kind of a domino or spiral effect on the negative situation for them. Explain how migration of African Americans into urban areas and the migration of middle class whites out of urban areas into the suburbs impacted U.S. cities. The loss of the middle class hurt cities economically because they lost their base, their financial base, their tax base, their revenue base, people who bought products or purchased services, went to dinner, things like that, went to the theater. The loss of the middle class also hurt cities politically because they lost some of their top political influence. As you get to the particular region that kind of represents the impoverished class, they're going to get less attention from, let's say, politicians, unfortunately, in some cases. Not everybody's looking out for those who are struggling within society. Nine, why did urban renewal projects often fail to revitalize urban areas? In an effort to renew aging urban neighborhoods, the government often destroyed neighborhoods, basically kicking in like a bulldozer and just clearing them. And when you cleared out the older housing and buildings, you usually put in freeways or other developments. And in some of your big cities, a lot of these new developments were priced out too expensive for your lower class or your poorer members of society to rent or use or go to. Instead of helping to renew these areas, these projects often succeeded in only displacing the poor from their homes. Ten, compare and contrast the characteristics of the urban and rural poverty in the 1950s. Similar between urban and rural poor, did not receive adequate help from the government. The government kind of turned its back on both. Differences: urban poor, they were concentrated in large cities, were recipients of government housing projects, were sometimes displaced and otherwise victimized by urban renewal. They suffered from high crime rates. The rural poor were victims of the farming decline and they left behind as the economy adapted or changed, and they didn't change with the adapting economy. 11, what attracted Mexican Americans to the Brasileiro program? Why did many continue to participate in this program despite some difficult conditions? Despite what some would say exploitation, the Brasileiro program was better than the situations the immigrants had left behind in their home country, usually from obviously Mexico. They participated because they wanted to be American citizens and they wanted a job. It was kind of admirable. They were leaving one country for another with hope of a better life for themselves and their family. 12, how did some people justify the idea of the termination policy for Native Americans? What were the drawbacks of this policy? People claim the policy would allow Native Americans to assimilate to the rest of American society. However, the law ended tribal government as well as government responsibility for the health and well-being of Native Americans. This meant that Native Americans lost economic support as well as political power, kind of a double negative there for Native Americans, who have obviously been one of the groups who have most suffered in the span of American history. Lesson reflection: what problems did minorities face in the years after World War II? Obviously, the ongoing battle for civil rights, segregation is still a huge problem with the Jim Crow laws in the South, job equality, many struggled in the slums, getting trapped in the inner city of many of the cities across the country. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.